The wind, a razor across the high plains, tore at the threadbare shawl wrapped around the girl. Each gust threatened to rip her small, chilled fingers from their desperate grip on the fabric. Her breath came in shallow, misting puffs, lost instantly in the vast, indifferent expanse. Below, the gully dropped away, a dark, stony moor that promised only a colder, harder bed than the one she'd been torn from. Tears, frozen almost before they left her eyes, tracked icy paths down her dirt-smeared cheeks. She didn't understand why. Mama was gone, a soft memory of lullabies and warm hands, and then there was her. The woman with eyes like chips of winter ice and a voice that could curdle milk. This morning, that voice had been a low hiss, promises of a game, a surprise. The surprise was the jolting cart ride, the sudden stop, the shove. Now, only the wind answered her soft, choked sobs, its howl a monstrous echo of the desolation in her heart. She was 7 years old, her name was Elara, and she was alone. The sun, a weak disk in the grey sky, began its slow descent, painting the sharp peaks of the distant mountains in bruised purples and bloody oranges. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She scrambled, half falling, down a less precipitous part of the gully wall, her small boots dislodging loose scree that rattled into the growing shadows. A twisted, skeletal tree offered meager shelter at the bottom, its branches like grasping claws. Elara huddled against its trunk, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to make herself smaller, to disappear. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of dry leaves in the wind, sent a jolt of terror through her. Wolves, bears, stories the stepmother had used to make her cower now felt terrifyingly real. The cold seeped into her bones, a heavy, numbing ache. Her crying subsided into whimpers, then into a silence born of exhaustion and encroaching despair. She clutched a small, smooth stone in her pocket, a relic from a day when Mama had taken her to a river, a day filled with sunshine and laughter. It was all she had left. He moved with the silence of the land itself, a figure as weathered and enduring as the ancient rocks that studded his ranch. Elias had seen the cart, a speck in the distance earlier, heading towards the Badlands beyond his north fence line. Unusual. No one went that way unless they were lost or up to no good. His eyes, accustomed to scanning for stray cattle or the distant shimmer of heat haze, were sharp. It wasn't until his evening check of the perimeter, the air already biting with the promise of a hard frost, that he saw the small, disturbed patch of earth near the gully's edge. His horse, a sturdy roan named Dusty, shifted uneasily beneath him, ears swiveling. Elias slid from the saddle, his movements economical, born of long habit. He felt the vibrations in the ground more than heard any sound, a skill honed by years of silence. His world had been quiet for 3 decades, since the fever stole his hearing, leaving him in a landscape of muted rumbles and the internal rhythm of his own pulse. He approached the gully rim, his gaze sweeping the shadowed depths. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, a flicker of movement, a patch of lighter color against the dark trunk of the dead pine. Not an animal. Too still, too small. He carefully made his way down, his worn leather boots finding purchase on the loose stones with practiced ease. As he neared, the shape resolved itself. A child. Curled up, unmoving. Fear, a cold fist, squeezed his chest, a feeling he hadn't known for many years. He knelt, his shadow falling over the small form. Gently, he reached out a calloused hand, touching the girl's shoulder. Elara started violently, a small, terrified sound escaping her lips. Her eyes, huge and dark in her pale face, flew open, fixing on him with raw panic. She tried to scramble away, crab-like, further into the inadequate shelter of the tree roots, but she was weak, disoriented. Elias held his hands up, palms open, a universal gesture of peace. He kept his face soft, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He was a big man, rough-looking, he knew. To a child, especially a lost and frightened one, he must look like a monster. He pointed to himself, then tapped his chest. Elias. He mouthed his name slowly, though he knew she couldn't hear him speak it any more than he could hear her cry. He then pointed to her, a questioning look on his face. Her lips trembled. She just stared, breath hitching. He noted the tear tracks, the dirt, the thinness of her shawl. Anger, cold and pure, rose in him. Someone had done this. Someone had left her here. He reached into his saddlebag, which he'd slung over his shoulder, and pulled out a canteen and a piece of jerky. He offered the canteen first. She flinched, but her eyes were fixed on the water. Slowly, agonizingly, she reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers brushed his, cold as ice. He helped her guide it to her lips, and she drank, deep, desperate gulps. He broke off a small piece of jerky, holding it out. She took it, her gaze never leaving his face, as if trying to decipher the silent language of his intentions. The sun was almost gone now, the air dangerously cold. He couldn't leave her here. He pointed up, out of the gully, then towards the direction of his ranch, a subtle lift of his chin. He made a rocking motion with his arms, like holding a baby, then pointed to Dusty, who waited patiently above. "Come. With me. Safe." He hoped his eyes conveyed what his voice could not. She hesitated, her small body racked with shivers. Then, with a tiny, almost imperceptible nod, she allowed him to gently scoop her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. As he carried her up the steep incline, her head lolled against his shoulder, a fragile trust offered in the face of utter desolation. The wind still howled, but now, for Ilara, it carried the faintest, most fragile whisper of something other than despair. The ride to the ranch was slow, Elias careful to shield Ilara from the worst of the wind. She was a silent, shivering bundle in his arms, her eyes closed, though whether in sleep or sheer exhaustion, he couldn't tell. He felt the tremors that ran through her small frame, the occasional hitch of her breath. The lights of his small cabin, a warm yellow smudge against the deepening indigo of the twilight, were a welcome sight. Dismounting, he carried her inside, into the modest warmth of the main room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire already crackling, a habit born of solitary evenings. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs, a worn armchair, and a small kitchen area made up the rest. It was sparse, but clean, and to Ilara, waking slightly as the warmth enveloped her, it felt like a palace compared to the gully. Elias gently set her down in the armchair, which swallowed her small form. He added more wood to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. He then moved to the small stove, his movements efficient. Soon, the smell of broth began to fill the small space, a comforting, savory aroma. Ilara watched him, her eyes wide and wary, tracking his every move. He was big, and the silence that surrounded him was unnerving. She was used to voices, even the harsh ones. This quiet was a different kind of emptiness. He brought her a mug of the warm broth, gesturing for her to drink. It was simple, just stock and a few vegetables, but it was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. The warmth spread through her, chasing away some of the deep chill. He sat on one of the straight-back chairs, watching her, not crowding her, just there. After she finished, he took the empty mug. He then pointed to a small alcove, where a narrow bed was built into the wall, piled with thick blankets. He mimed sleeping, head tilted, eyes closed. Then he pointed to her. She understood. A bed. Warmth. But her eyes darted to the door, then back to him. Fear still clung to her like the prairie dust. He saw it. He went to a chest in the corner and pulled out a thick, woolen blanket, far finer than her tattered shawl. He laid it over her, tucking it gently around her shoulders. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-roughened hands. He then picked up a piece of chalk and a small slate he kept for jotting down notes to traders or leaving himself reminders. He wrote, in clear, block letters, "You are safe." He held it up for her to see. Her eye scanned the words, her brow furrowed in concentration. She could read, a little. Mama had taught her. She looked from the slate to his face, searching. His expression was steady, his gaze direct, and in their depths, she saw no deceit, only a quiet concern. He then drew a crude picture of a house, with smoke coming from the chimney, and pointed to it, then to the room around them. Then he drew a stick figure of himself, and then one of a small girl beside him, inside the house. He tapped the girl, then looked at her. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod was her only response, but it was enough. Elias rose, and to her surprise, he didn't go to the other bed in the room, his own larger cot against the far wall. Instead, he took a spare blanket, walked to the hearth, and settled himself on the floor, his back against the rough stones, facing her. He would stay there, a silent guardian. Elara watched him for a long time, the firelight flickering on his weathered face, making the lines around his eyes seem deeper. The silence of the cabin was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire and her own soft breathing. It was a different silence now, not empty, but watchful. Slowly, the bone-deep exhaustion began to claim her. Her eyelids grew heavy. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had receded, like a tide going out, leaving a raw, aching vulnerability. She clutched the edge of the thick blanket, its wool soft against her cheek. Before sleep finally took her, she thought she saw him smile, a small, sad curve of his lips in the firelight. Or perhaps it was just a trick of the shadows. The days that followed fell into a quiet rhythm. Elias rose before dawn, his movement stirring Elara from her sleep in the small alcove bed. He would already have the fire going, the chill of the night chased away. He'd offer her a bowl of warm porridge, sometimes with a spoonful of precious honey he got from a trader. They ate in silence, a silence Elara was slowly growing accustomed to. He communicated with gestures, with the slate, with expressive movements of his face. He taught her a few simple signs: eat, drink, more, sleep, good. She was a quick learner, her young mind eager, and her eyes, those wide, haunted eyes, began to lose some of their constant fear, replaced by a watchful curiosity. She would follow him as he did his chores, a small shadow at his heels. He never told her to stay, never shooed her away. He'd muck out Dusty's stall, check the fences, chop wood, his movements strong and sure. She'd sit on a log, watching, sometimes trying to help by picking up small fallen branches or carrying a bucket that was almost too heavy for her. He showed her the chickens, how to collect the eggs carefully. One morning, he found her gently stroking Dusty's velvety nose, a tiny, hesitant smile on her face. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it struck him with a force that made his chest ache. He realized, with a jolt, how much her presence had already changed the contours of his solitary life. The silence was still there, but it was no longer empty. It was filled with her small sounds, the scuff of her boots, the occasional soft hum as she played with a piece of wood she'd found, pretending it was a doll. He found an old, smooth piece of pine and, in the evenings by the fire, began to carve it. She would watch, mesmerized, as a shape slowly emerged from the wood, a small, rough-hewn horse. The nights were still hard for Elara. Nightmares plagued her, snatching her from sleep with choked cries. She'd see the stepmother's icy eyes, feel the brutal shove, the terrifying aloneness of the gully. On those nights, Elias would be there instantly. He couldn't hear her cries, but he was a light sleeper, attuned to any change in the cabin's atmosphere, any restless movement from her alcove. He wouldn't touch her unless she reached for him, but he would sit near, his solid presence a bulwark against the terrors of the dark. Sometimes, he would light a candle and simply sit with the slate, ready if she wanted to try and express what frightened her. She rarely did, not with words. But once, after a particularly bad dream, she took the chalk with a trembling hand and drew a stick figure of a woman, tall and menacing, with sharp, angry lines for a mouth. Then she drew a tiny, falling figure beside it. Elias looked at the drawing, his jaw tightening. He gently took the chalk and drew his own stick figure, larger, standing protectively in front of the small one. He looked at Elara, his eyes conveying a fierce promise. Never again. One afternoon, a fierce blizzard swept down from the mountains without warning, trapping them inside. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the shutters, piling snowdrifts against the cabin door. Elara, initially frightened by the storm's ferocity, found a strange comfort in being sealed inside with Elias. The fire roared, the small cabin was an island of warmth in a sea of white fury. Elias spent the time mending tack, his large hands surprisingly deft with needle and leather. Elara sat by the fire, the nearly finished wooden horse in her lap. He had given it to her the day before, and she hadn't let it out of her sight since. She ran her fingers over its smooth, carved flanks. She looked up at Elias, his face intent on his work. She pointed to herself, then slowly, carefully, formed the letters of her name in the air with her finger. Elai. He watched, then nodded, a slow smile spreading across his face. He pointed to himself. Elis, he signed back, using the rudimentary alphabet they were beginning to develop. It was a breakthrough, a fragile bridge of understanding built across the chasm of silence and trauma. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, a quiet kind of hope was taking root, tenacious and surprising, like a wildflower pushing through frozen earth. The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, the world outside was transformed, a dazzling expanse of white under a painfully bright sun. The silence was immense, profound, broken only by the drip of melting snow from the eaves. Elias had to dig them out, the snow drifted high against the door. Elara, bundled in an old coat of his that swallowed her whole, watched from the doorway, her breath misting in the frigid air. There was a new lightness about her, a subtle shift from the constant, hunched fear. The shared confinement, the simple routines, his unwavering, quiet presence, it was all working a slow magic. That afternoon, as Elias was checking on the lean-to where he kept his few cattle, he heard, or rather, felt, a sound that wasn't part of the usual ranch rhythm. A sharp, cracking vibration through the frozen ground. He turned, his eyes scanning the tree line at the edge of his property. A horseman. Then another. Not traders. These men rode with a different kind of purpose, their posture alert, scanning the landscape. A cold dread settled in Elias's stomach. He quickly moved back towards the cabin, his gaze urgent. Elara was just outside, trying to build a small snowman, her cheeks pink from the cold. He caught her eye, made a swift, downward chopping motion with his hand, down, hide. Her playful expression vanished. She knew that look, that urgency. Without a word, she scrambled back inside the cabin. Elias followed, his mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? He didn't have trouble, not usually. His life was too isolated for that. But the image of Elara, abandoned and terrified, flashed in his mind. Could it be related to her? He barred the door, a heavy wooden beam slotting into place. He went to the small window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. The horsemen were closer now, perhaps a quarter mile away, heading directly for his cabin. There were 3 of them. They looked hard, armed. He moved to Elara, who was pressed against the wall near the fireplace, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. He knelt before her, taking her small, cold hands in his. He looked directly into her eyes, trying to project calm he didn't entirely feel. He pointed to the trapdoor hidden beneath the rag rug in the corner of the room, a small root cellar, cramped and dark, but hidden. He made a gesture for her to go there, to be silent. Her lips trembled. No, she whispered, the sound barely audible, one of the few words she'd spoken. She clung to his hands. Stay. A sharp rap on the door vibrated through the cabin. Elias squeezed her hands gently, then released them. He stood, his face grim. He pointed to the cellar again, more firmly this time. Then he pointed to himself, and tapped his chest. I will handle this. He gave her a look that brooked no argument. Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded, a tiny, jerky movement. She lifted the rug, her small hand struggling with the heavy wooden trapdoor. Elias helped her, then watched as she descended into the darkness. He slid the door back into place, replacing the rug just as another, harder knock came. He took a deep breath, unbarred the door, and opened it a crack, his body blocking the view into the cabin. 3 men sat on their horses, their faces hard-bitten, eyes cold. One, clearly the leader, leaned forward. We're looking for a girl, he said, his voice rough. Small, dark hair. Seen anyone like that? Elias kept his expression neutral. He shook his head, then pointed to his ears and shook his head again, indicating he couldn't hear. The leader scowled. Deaf, huh? He spat on the snow. Great, he made a gesture, drawing a small figure in the air. Girl. Then he pointed around, a questioning look. Elias shook his head again, a slow, deliberate movement. He tried to look uncomprehending, harmless. Another man, younger, with shifty eyes, spoke up. Maybe she's inside. We should look. Elias tensed. He stood his ground, not moving from the doorway. The leader considered him for a moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. Elias met it steadily, his own eyes like chips of granite. He knew he looked like a poor, solitary rancher. Not a threat. Not someone hiding anything of value. She was left out near the Blackwood Gully a few days back, the leader said, louder this time, as if volume would penetrate deafness. Stepmother wants her found. Says she ran off. He watched Elias's face for any flicker of recognition. Elias kept his expression blank. Blackwood Gully. His heart clenched. These men were almost certainly sent by the woman who had abandoned Ilara. The word stepmother confirmed it. He gave a slight, dismissive shrug, as if to say, none of my businesses. He made a gesture of shivering, pointing to the vast, snowy landscape, implying no child could survive out there. The leader grunted. Probably coyote bait by now then. Waste of a damn trip. He looked around the small, isolated ranch one last time. If you do see anything, he trailed off, realizing the futility of talking. He gave a curt nod, wheeled his horse, and the three men rode away, their dark shapes diminishing against the stark white snow. Elias watched them until they were out of sight, his body rigid. Only when they were tiny specks in the distance did he allow himself to breathe. He closed the door, barred it, and sagged against it for a moment, the adrenaline leaving him shaky. Then he hurried to the trap door, pulling it open. Ilara, he mouthed, peering into the darkness. A small, tear-streaked face looked up at him. He reached down, and she practically flew into his arms, clinging to him with a desperate strength that belied her size. He held her tight, stroking her hair, feeling the frantic beat of her heart against his own. He carried her to the armchair, settling her in his lap, something he rarely did. She buried her face in his shirt, her small body trembling. He rocked her gently, making soft, soothing sounds in his throat, sounds she couldn't hear but could perhaps feel. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this wasn't over. The stepmother wanted her back. And people like that didn't give up easily. The encounter with the horseman cast a long shadow. The fragile sense of peace they had cultivated was shattered, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Elias became even more vigilant, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He double-checked the locks, reinforced a loose shutter. He taught Ilara a specific signal, 3 quick taps on the floor, that meant immediate silence and hiding in the cellar. She practiced it with a grim seriousness that tugged at his heart. No child should have to learn such things. Her nightmares returned with a vengeance, filled with shadowy men and the stepmother's cruel face. Elias would hold her, his silence a comforting weight in the darkness, until her trembling subsided. He felt a growing rage towards the faceless woman who had inflicted such terror on this small, innocent life. And a deeper, fiercer protectiveness for Ilara than he had ever thought himself capable of feeling again. He started carrying his old hunting rifle with him whenever he ventured out, even just to the barn. The days grew shorter, the cold more biting. They spent more time indoors, the small cabin their sanctuary. To distract her, and himself, Elias began to teach her more. He drew pictures of animals, writing their names beneath on the slate. She copied them meticulously, her tongue poked out in concentration. He showed her how to mend small tears in her clothes, how to knead dough for their simple bread. These small, shared tasks became anchors in the uncertainty, moments of normalcy that held the fear at bay. One evening, as a bitter wind clawed at the cabin, Ilara sat by the fire, carefully drawing on a piece of smoothed bark Elias had given her, using a charred stick. He watched her, the firelight softening the worried lines on her small face. She looked up, caught his eye, and held up her drawing. It was a picture of the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney. Next to it, she had drawn two figures, one large, one small, holding hands. She pointed to the large figure, then to Elias. Then to the small one, and to herself. A hesitant, hopeful smile touched her lips. Elias felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. He reached out, his calloused finger gently tracing the outline of the two figures. He nodded, his own smile mirroring hers. Yes. Us. It was a declaration, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, forged in fear and solitude, strengthened by quiet acts of care. He knew he would do anything to protect her, to keep that small, hopeful smile on her face. He was no longer just a solitary rancher, he was a guardian. And Elara was no longer just a lost girl, she was his. The thought, unspoken, settled deep in his heart, as solid and enduring as the mountains that ringed their hidden valley. Winter deepened its grip, the land locked under a thick blanket of snow. The isolation, once a comfort to Elias, now felt like both a shield and a vulnerability. It kept them hidden, but it also meant they were utterly alone if trouble came again. He laid in extra supplies on his rare trips to the distant, sleepy trading post, always taking a circuitous route, always watchful. He never took Elara with him on these trips, leaving her hidden in the cabin with strict instructions, a store of food and water, and Dusty nearby in the barn, just in case. The thought of her alone, even for a few hours, was a constant torment, but the risk of her being seen was greater. During one such trip, a grizzled old trapper, Jed, a man Elias occasionally bartered with, signed a question to him. Jed knew some basic signs, enough for simple commerce. Trouble? You look tight. Elias considered. Jed was discreet, a man of the wilderness like himself. He signed back, looking for girl. Bad people. Jed's bushy eyebrows rose. He nodded slowly, his gaze shrewd. Stepmother? Heard whispers. Rich woman. Cruel. Elias's blood ran cold. Rich. That explained the persistent riders. This wasn't just about retrieving a runaway, it was about something more, perhaps an inheritance, or silencing a witness. The danger felt suddenly magnified. He signed, keep safe. My place. Jed nodded again. Will do. You too, Elias. The brief exchange confirmed his worst fears. The stepmother wouldn't give up. Back at the cabin, the reunion with Elara was always a profound relief for both of them. She would launch herself into his arms, her earlier fear forgotten in the joy of his return. He started teaching her more practical skills, things that might help her survive if the worst happened. How to find edible roots, how to track small game, though the thought of her needing to do so made him ache, how to build a small, smokeless fire. She absorbed it all with a quiet intensity. One afternoon, while checking a line of snares he'd set for rabbits, he found one disturbed, the rabbit gone, but not by a predator. Human tracks. Small ones, hesitant. Nearby, under a bush, he found the rabbit, clumsily but successfully dispatched and hidden. Elara. He followed her faint trail back towards the cabin. She was by the woodpile, her face pale, hands bloody, trying to skin the rabbit with a small knife he'd given her for carving, her movements clumsy but determined. When she saw him, she froze, guilt and fear in her eyes. He walked over, knelt beside her. He didn't scold. Instead, he gently took the knife, showed her the correct way to hold it, the best way to make the cuts. He worked with her, side by side, their hands sometimes brushing. When they were done, he signed, "Good. You are learning." A small, proud smile touched her lips. It was a grim lesson, but a necessary one. In this harsh world, strength and resourcefulness were as vital as warmth and food. That night, as she slept, Elias sat by the fire, the weight of their precarious situation heavy on him. He looked at her, curled under the blankets, the wooden horse clutched in her hand. Her face, in sleep, was peaceful, innocent. He would not let that innocence be stolen again. He had to find a way to make them truly safe, to end this threat for good. But how? He was one man, deaf and aging, against a wealthy, ruthless woman. The odds felt impossible. Yet, looking at Elara, he knew he had to try. He owed her that. He owed it to the flicker of hope she had reignited in his own solitary heart. The long, quiet winter had forged a bond, but spring would bring new dangers, new reckonings. And he had to be ready.